Hello, and welcome to Design Tools. I'm your host and guide through this wonderful adventure we call life, Gabriel Botkins. This season we'll be covering 3D Studio Max, and in today's episode we will cover the setup and user interface. So let's get started. Now, there are 3 zones that I'm going to cover, maybe 4. In this initial look at the user interface. Up here we have the toolbar with all kinds of buttons. You know, the file menu and all that kind of stuff. It's typical for most applications. Over here we have our command panel. In the middle here we have 4 viewports. And down here at the bottom there's just a couple of little things that we're going to cover. We will not be getting into any animation or anything like that. But without further ado, let's get started. So this is typically what you will see when you start up 3D Studio Max. And there's a couple of things that I just want to do real quick. Over to our left we have, over to the right we have the command panel. And if we mouse over just to the edge of the command panel where we get the arrows to do that, or the cursor to do that, we can click and drag so it's now double width. If you'd like, go ahead and do that. It's not required, but I highly recommend it. And we'll get started with the top toolbar. So here we have undo and redo. We have a few things that I won't get into. The selection filter. So this allows you, when you want to select objects, you can select exclusively geometry, shapes, lights, cameras, and other items. We have select object, which is by default when you click and drag, so you don't necessarily have to click that. There's a list option that that'll populate. The more objects you make, they'll all be listed here, and you can select them by name. We have different types of selections. So right now I have a rectangle selection. You could change that to, let's say, a circle, or you could use a drawing pattern such as that. And let's see, I don't use window crossing. Select and move is on by default. You have rotate, scale, and then there's these are relative to scale, so you can use the pivot point as the center if you have multiple objects selected, and so forth. You could have a common, average center point, etc. Select and manipulate, keyboard shortcut override, which you may or may not have to use. Then you have our snap tools here. Let's see, we have mirror as an option, align. Let's see, there's the scene explorer, which you can toggle on and off, which is another way to list items. You have the layer explorer, or layer manager, so by default we're on layer 0. Let's see, toggle rhythm, curve editor, those are animation type things. Material editor, which we'll get into shortly. Render setup, which we'll jump into right now. So it's the teapot with a little menu icon over the top of it. And there's one thing you want to do right off the bat. You're already in the common tab, so you can either scroll, or when you have the little hand, you can click and push up. And down here, you have assign renderer. By default, it is the default scan line renderer. We want to change that to mental ray. And I'll show you why real quick. If we go back to our material editor, you can either click that or press M, as in Mike. And you'll see here we don't have what we're looking for. There are materials, maps, controllers, etc. But what we're looking for are a specific set of materials. And once you change your default scanline renderer to mental ray, okay, and then you have to change your active shade to mental ray as well. And then we can close that. And press M or click the icon, and then it will allow us to give the option in the material map browser area. In the blank spot, right click and choose Autodesk Material Library. These are the materials that we're going to use through most of the demonstrations. We'll get into some custom things, but we want to make sure that we have that. It has all the basics that you need, metals, wood, you name it, paint, it's all there. So we can close that for now. You will go back into render setup when you have something to render. Right now, it's, you want to define your resolution. You can go in there and edit that. There are a few preset options. And then, let's see. Render frame set window, we won't really use, but we will use render production eventually. Let's see. And then you probably won't have these yet, the axis constraints and the extras. So if you want, right-click up here in an empty spot on the toolbar, click axis constraints, so that shows up, and then extras, so that shows up. I use the measure tool a lot, and these help for movement and snapping. And speaking of snapping, these are your snap options. So this is direction, and this is angle snap. So rather than having 1.289, angle snap, it'll snap in increments of 5. So you get 5 degrees, 10 degrees, etc. For snap toggle, right-click that. It'll bring up your options. And I typically snap to the vertex, and I have all these other things turned off. If you want to use the grid, go ahead. I typically work without it. There's the bounding box, endpoints, midpoints, faces. Those are all very useful. But like I said, I typically only use vertex snapping. Now there is the marker. You'll notice once we start moving things around with snap, it'll show a little ribbon to show where you're coming from. I just leave it on by default. And the important part is you want to enable axis constraints if they are not already enabled. And then that will allow these to help us out in the future. So that's a good quick setup for that. That's the basic parts of your toolbar. Now over here in the command panel, we have the create tab. You could do a lot of work over here. And this could be a little bit confusing, but basically you create objects using this tab. So you could create geometry, and there's different types of geometry. These are all standard primitives, planes, tubes, etc. We have extended primitives, which are chamfer boxes, capsules. I think those are most of the ones that I use. Maybe oil tank every now and then. I don't typically get into this. But compound objects, there is one that I use quite often, and that is the Boolean, which we'll get into in a later lesson. Then still while we're on the Create tab, there are shapes, which are splines, lines, circles, arcs. Those are used pretty often. And then text. This is how I had my text display up earlier. The old way of doing it was that you would make something in Illustrator, save it, and import the vector, and then use it that way. But now 3D Studio Max has a nice text tool that you're able to use. Lights, which we will definitely get into. And since we changed our renderer, we will be using photometric lights. You have the option of standard, but we will be using photometric because the renderer will allow us to do some nice effects very easily with no problem. The other one that we'll get into are the cameras, typically target cameras. Helpers, space warps, and systems we won't necessarily get into. So the modify panel. Now you can't see anything here now, but you'll be doing a lot of work in this. So if we go back to our create panel and let's say we'll make a box. We'll get back out of compound objects and go into standard primitives. We'll drop in a box. So click, drag, release, and then push up or down. Right? And you have all these options here. So we could make it 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot. And there you go. Right? So I just clicked off of that and oh wait, I want to make it twice as big. So we can click and drag. Whoop, I didn't change that back. So I did select it using the tool, but typically I just have it on the square select, click and drag. There we go. And then those options aren't coming back up that were there initially. So if we go to the modify tab, we could now go through and change them. So 2 feet, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet tall, right? We could also change the number of segments, which you can't see if I'm increasing them. But if you press F3, you get a wireframe. You can change it back by hitting F3 again. If you want to see it shaded, press F4. And you can now see those width segments that we put in. We could reduce them or increase them. Same thing with length and height, and so on, right? So you'll come back to this an awful lot. Another thing we'll get into, we could either right-click onto the object and convert to editable poly, or from the drop-down list up here, we could go into edit poly, which we will get into in the next episode. But for now, I just wanted to show you that's how you get some things done. You have all sorts of options in here, which we will cover later on. Up next is the hierarchy. Now in the front view, so real quick, we have the top view, the front view, the left view, and the perspective view. But if we select our object in the front view, notice that the pivot point is down here at the bottom. This is typically good, this is what we want. But in some instances, once we've made a compound or complex object, we'll want to move that center point or that pivot point based on how, wherever it's moved. So if we go to Effect Pivot Only, we could then move the pivot around. So this will work with a hinge, perhaps. Let's say if this is a door. And we turn on Snap by pressing S, or we can click up here to the Snap toggle. And I'm going to use the X constraint, and then there we go. I moved it all the way to the left, and since it's not, we want it on the center, and from the top view that is centered. But if we want to change it to the corner, we can do that as well. And then I turn off Effect Pivot Only, and let's say I hit select and rotate, or if I press the E button, I could then rotate it. You'll see here, right around where my cursor is, getting 14.98, 17.23 as I'm rotating this. If I hit A, you'll notice just up here this turned on. A, right? So now it's going in increments of 5. So 5 degrees, 10 degrees, etc. Right? And it's acting more like a hinge. But let's say if I don't want that, I'll just leave it how it was, Effect Pivot Only, and I can center to the object. Right? So now it is in the center of the object. If I want to place it back down to the 0 plane, on the ground essentially, doesn't matter what view I'm in, I go down here to this bottom bar, and then I can, press 0? No? Oh, because I'm in rotate, sorry. If I press W and I bring back move, right? You'll see down here, this is where the pivot is, and I'll just right-click that so it's zeroed out, or I could type in 0, and it's back to where it was. And I click Effect Pivot Only again, and we're left with what we had. All right. We could skip motion, but we will go into display on the Command tab, and there's all sorts of things. We could hide items by category. If I click geometry, for instance, anything that's geometry will be hidden. Okay, and then there's display properties. You can do this by selecting an object, and I could show edges only, which will show each triangle, or uncheck edges only, and it'll show each triangle in the object. So I check it, and then you eliminate that extra little vertex thing. We can make it see-through, and then here's something that's could be important to you or not: show frozen in gray. So we'll leave that checked, and if I right-click, I could say free selection, and it is now in gray. I'll right-click, so I can no longer select it. All right? Doesn't matter which viewport, I can't select it because it's frozen. So if I right-click again, and I go unfreeze all, I can now select it. So if I uncheck frozen in gray, I choose to freeze selection, it stays the color, the object color that it is, but I can no longer select it. I like to leave frozen in gray, that way I know it's frozen. So we will unfreeze all, select it again, and show frozen in gray. Another thing we can do, and it doesn't matter, well, if you're on the modify, or if you're in the hierarchy, or if you're in display, you still have the object name, box 1, which you could rename. We could just name it box 0003, for example. And then if we click the pink up here, or double click it, we could change the color to whatever we want. And this is for display and rendering if you don't assign a material to it later. Now, the last one is utilities. And we could do measure, which is also up in the extras toolbar up here. So if we have several objects, we can measure the distance between them. Now the next thing I want to show you is, or go over, are the windows. We have a grid in each box, or in each viewport. And we can click on these little icons to change it to left, etc. You know, top. There are shortcut keys. So if I want to rotate around an object, I could hold down Alt and then middle click and drag, and it'll move around. Right? I could also hold down Control and Alt together, and it'll zoom in and out. If I select an object and hit Z, it'll zoom in. That's a little too close for me, so I'll hold down Control and Alt, middle click, and drag down so it zooms out. So this is basically how I work around an object with the camera view. Now you could do this in any viewport, right? And also, I don't usually work with a grid. So I will hit G, and it turns the grid off. I'll do this in each of the windows. And if I want it back, I could hit G. See, as you can see, the more oblique the angle, the more kind of, you can get a moire effect, or it just becomes interfering. So that's why I typically work without it. Now what happens if I want to reset these views? I could use this guy up here and drag around and hope that I get it right. Or if I select, you could select each viewport. You can tell by the gold line around it. If I press T, it'll show me the top. I'll click this next viewport over here. I'll press F for front. Then I'll click this one down here. I'll press L. And it'll show me the left side, right? The other thing you could do is these are in parallel, orthographic view, as opposed to perspective, which, they have vanishing points. So if I'm on this viewport up here and it has an angle, but I want perspective, I hit P and it's in perspective. I don't know the hotkey to change it back, but if I go up here to the top so it's highlighted, where it says perspective, I could change it to orthographic. Change that back to front by pressing F. And in the perspective window, I can just, or any of these windows, I could go down and choose various views. Let's say if I want a view of the right, which doesn't have a hotkey, I could do that. So, orthographic is U. So I'll hit P, I'll rotate around it, see in perspective, I'll press U to change it back to orthographic, and so on. Now all of these have different shading options as well. So right now we're in shaded edge faces. So it's showing edge faces means that you see these lines. And I had said that you could press F4 to hide them. So now it's realistic. Press F4 again, realistic plus edge faces. Now shaded and realistic doesn't really have a big difference right now because there are no lights in the scenes, but later on when we add lights, we might want to go to realistic. And if we show lights and shadows, there's a default scene light. It doesn't necessarily exist, but if we choose illuminate with default lights, did that actually happen? Lights and shadows. Illuminate with default lights. There are no lights in the scene, so it will continue to display with the scene light. That doesn't necessarily exist. So if we choose consistent colors, then it's all green. 100% lit. So we'll just change it to shaded. If we want to go back to the wireframe, click up here. We can click wireframe. There's another interesting one that's kind of fun. You can play around with these. I'm not going to go over them very much, but we could change it to clay. And it has kind of a clay look to it. Now, a lot of the time, you'll see me working in a single window. If I press or hold and press Alt and then press W, it brings it up full screen, right? I'll change it to perspective. And I can change it to top view, front view, left view. I'll go back to perspective, and I'll zoom. You can zoom out. You can also use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. It's a little more choppy. You get finer control if you hold down Control and Alt. So, if I want to go back to all 4 windows, hold down Alt, press W, and here we are. And that is pretty much it for the command panel for right now. So, this leaves us with this lower area down here. I'm going to select our box, and you can see different coordinates, right? I'm going to turn on the grid so you can see the movement. So I could use this to move the object as well. I could click and drag the arrows, or I could punch in a specific value. So let's say I'll put it 2 feet over on the x-axis, which is more like this, as you can see here and here. And I will move back on the y-axis, so watch the top or this perspective grid, and I'll type in 3 for 3 feet. Moves it back, and if I want to move it up in the air 1 foot, there's the z-axis. I can move it up in the air 1 foot, so you can see it here. Right? Now, if I don't want to do any of those things, I could right-click on the arrows to zero everything out, or I could type in new values. I'm just going to right-click, and everything is zeroed once again. Now, let's say I have multiple objects. One of the things you could do is hold down Shift, then click and drag. Right? I could either do a copy or instance. Instance means it's the same object. I'll show you that real quick. We'll get into this in more detail. But if I do an instance, remember that's the one to the above, and I'm going to hold down Shift and drag along the x-axis, and we're going to make that a copy. Now, I have made this through the Modify panel into an Edit Poly, or you could right-click on it and convert to Edit Poly. It's already that way. So one of the things I could do is manipulate it by vertex, the edge, there's a border option, polygon option, and an element option. Right now the only options that will work are polygon, edge, and vertex. The other 2 won't work yet because we don't have any of the other sub-elements. Borders typically only work where there's holes in an object. An element is if there's multiple parts. So I'm going to press 1. You could also click here at the vertex. So pressing 1 is the same thing as clicking on the vertex. There's also 2 for the edge, 3 for border, 4 for polygon, and 5 for element. So I can switch through those as quickly as I can using hotkeys. So I'm going to say 1, and then I click and drag, and I can grab, or I can click directly onto a vertex. We'll take a couple here. And then I'm going to, once I have a few selected, you can tell because they're in red, I'm going to drag up, right? So the instance on top is mirroring and doing exactly the same thing because it's an instance, not a copy. The copy stays in the original form. So we're going to undo that with Control Z. You could step back, I think, up to 25 times by default. And that's basically it. There's one last part that I want to show you. Down here's the MaxScript mini listener. We're not going to mess with MaxScript right now, but with the measure tool, measure distance, and then I hit S to turn on snap. Or will I? No, let me hit escape. Okay, S for snap, I turned it on. Now the measure tool, or measure distance. And then, let's see, okay, here we go. So you see the little highlight, the little yellow crosshair? That means it's snapping to that point. I'm going to click once. I come down here and you see the dashed line. I'm going to click again. Down here in the MaxScript editor, it tells me the distance. 2 feet, 3.9 inches. So in case you're taking notes for when you're using multiple objects that have to be a certain part, let's say we want to build a part that bridges these two, we can use the measure tool to figure out how tall it has to be or what have you, whatever the distance is. And that is essentially it for the UI and interface and setup. There might be a couple of other things along the way. If you go to customize, you can customize the user interface. I believe one of the things that you'll want to do, if this comes up, here we go. You can customize the menus however you want. The keyboard shortcuts, the mouse, how it reacts, it's highly customizable. Toolbars, so when I right click, right, so you can customize those toolbars, whatever the options are that come in that. Menus, the drop downs like the create, the modifiers, you can change what's in that. The colors, for the viewport, right now it's the default dark theme. Those are all wonderful. So if we customize, if we go up to the menu up here and customize the custom UI scheme, we want to go down to the unit setup. Go to unit, US standard feet and decimal inches. So you'll see me, if you want to change it to fractional inches, that's fine. You could still actually type in fractional inches. You could actually type in metric units and it will automatically convert it. It's just what shows up when you're editing an object in the Modify tab. So I work in inches, and there we go. Lighting units, keep it at international, and click OK. And we're all good. You are set up and ready to go for what we're going to be doing in the future. So stay tuned for more. Next episode, we're going to be covering working on preset items, or things that you will be using over and over again. So I'm going to be using things like 2x4s and sheets of plywood for our asset browser. That way we don't have to remake everything over and over again each time we do a new scene. So hopefully you'll watch that. I hope this was helpful for you. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment and I'll get back to you and hopefully answer it in a new video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.